Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar on digital learning without connectivity, how one project is taking higher education to incarcerated students. I'm Alan Song, the facilitator for this webinar, and currently serving as part of the ASCILITE executive and organizing this series of ASCILITE webinars this year. Firstly, I would like to introduce you to the facilitator for this afternoon's webinar. Helen Farley is an Associate Professor, Digital Futures at the Australian Digital Futures Institute at the University of Southern Queensland. She's currently leading the USQ-led Collaborative Research Network (CRN) project with ANU and UniSA to develop a mobile learning evaluation framework. She was also the project lead of the funded From Access to Success project, which developed an internet-independent version of Moodle that will enable electronic access to course materials and activities for those students without internet access. This project has been so successful that Helen and ADFI were awarded $4.4 million through the Australian Government's Higher Education Participation and Pathway Program to take the Moodle and notebook computers to Indigenous and non-Indigenous incarcerated students across Australia. Helen has many years' experience as an educator in higher education and as a researcher of educational technology. Her research interests are focused around the use of mobile technologies, virtual worlds, and using technology to promote participation in higher education. Now, for this afternoon's one-hour webinar, Helen will share for about 30 minutes, and the remaining time will be open for Q&A. And during question and answer session, you could either post your question in the chat box or click onto the hand-raising button located on the left right below the image box, and I'll give you the right to speak. And when speaking, you can click onto the talk button, and after speaking, you can release the talk button. So without further ado, could you please help me to welcome Helen Farley.
Thanks for that, Alan. Maybe I'll just show that I really do exist. Here I am, and welcome from sunny Toowoomba. Now that's probably all of me that you need to see right now, so I'm going to turn my video off so we don't overwhelm the great USQ network. So hi everyone, and I'm really pleased that you could all come along to listen to me speak and hopefully ask some questions about what we're doing this afternoon. Now, I do want to make this a bit of a conversation, so if there's anything that you want to ask as we go through, please pop it into the chat box. That'll be perfectly fine, or you can wait until the end and there'll be some time for some questions there as well. First of all, let me say I'm really, really proud. This project that I'm working on, the Making the Connection project, was the recipient of an ASCILITE Innovation and Excellence Award this year. So we're really proud to have won that accolade. This is something that we've been working on for a number of years, probably since about 2009 and 2010. And, you know, it's after all that hard slog, it's only now that we're beginning to see some really good results. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into this presentation, and as I said, any questions or any comments that you'd like to make along the way, please just jump right in, because this is a conversation. So the focus of this project, the Making the Connection project, and the projects that came before it, is to actually take higher education into correctional centres around Australia. Australia has around 113 correctional centres across every state and territory jurisdiction, and that also includes the immigration detention centres as well. So you might think about why we would do this, because you know, generally the governments we've got most of the conservative governments across Australia, and they're running on a law and order agenda. And looking at trying to reduce crime rates by increasing incarceration rates. Australia has quite a high incarceration rate. We're looking at about 180 or 185 per 100,000 people, which is quite high. When you consider somewhere like Norway, which has about 70 per 100,000 people. And the reason why we try and get education into correctional centres, and particularly higher education, is because we know if we can give prisoners a post-secondary education, they're significantly less likely to return to prison upon release. Now, a lot of people have the attitude, well, they're in prison and they should be punished, and that's fine, but the fact is it costs the Australian taxpayer around $80,000 a year, and that's a fairly conservative number, $80,000 a year to keep a prisoner incarcerated. So that's quite a lot of money. So you can see that we don't have to reduce the incarceration rate by very much to make a significant saving to the taxpayer. The other thing we know about educated prisoners is that they tend to be less violent as well. So it's helping make the community safer. It's helping to make our prisons safer. And just think about the prisons, the prison officers who work in those prisons. It's really difficult and challenging for them to go through their lives, and it's actually, they lose a lot of time due to stress. Their chronic health conditions are rife, and so there's lots of reasons why it's a good thing for us to make a prison a safer place to be, not only for the prisoners, but for the people who work in those prisons. The other reason why we might look at educating prisoners as well is because if we can educate prisoners, then we can educate a lot of other people who are in other areas and who are under difficult conditions, just such as prisoners are. So in most correctional jurisdictions in Australia, with the exception of the Australian Capital Territory and with Tasmania, prisoners are not allowed to access the internet. So if we can find a way to educate people without internet, we can also find a way to help those other 50% of the world's population that also don't have access to the internet. That's an awful lot of people. 50% of the world's population does not have access to the internet. And you can imagine that would also be people in developing economies, so in Africa, in some parts of Asia, in some parts of South America, and through Northern Asia, for example. A lot of people in those areas don't have internet. But also, think about Australia. We're thinking about remote Indigenous communities don't have internet or often don't have internet. The FIFO DIDO workers, so fly-in, fly-out, drive-in, drive-out workers who are employed in the mining sector often don't have internet. Army or armed forces personnel on deployment to remote regions don't have access to the internet. People who work in the Australian Antarctic territories, they don't have internet. So if we can make education work for prisoners, we can make it work for all those other groups as well. So can I just get a little bit of an indication from the people who are already in this room, and maybe you can just pop it into chat, if your university actually provides higher education to prisoners. So if you could just drop it in chat for me to have a look. Okay, so you don't there, Dom? Okay, wow. Yes, USQ does, that's right. Right, okay. So you can imagine it's really difficult. USQ is actually the largest provider of higher education to prisoners in Australia. At any one time, before this project, we have about 300 students in enabling programs or bridging programs, and about 150 people in undergraduate programs. Now I noticed there's someone from Curtin. Curtin does a great job of getting people into getting education into prisons, and there's a number of great initiatives operating out of Curtin, particularly in relation to technology. So Brian Steels and Dot Goulding at Curtin University are doing some great work there. Okay, so as universities become increasingly online, it's increasingly difficult to provide education to those people without internet access. And many universities, and USQ is one of them, have gone entirely online. So USQ now does not provide printed text at all. It will not print out text and blocks of printed text to send to distance education students as we used to in the past. So that left us in a really tricky place when it came to dealing with our prisoners. Let me tell you a little bit about prisoners in Australia. There are about 37,000 prisoners in Australia. That rate of incarceration is rapidly increasing, and that's largely in response to tough on crime policies of Conservative governments, not just like Conservative governments though, all flavours of government at the moment. It's a common election promise that there'll be more police on the beat if a certain party gets elected, but for every 100 extra police on the beat, you need to build another 500-bed prison, and prisons are very, very expensive to build. The rate of Indigenous incarceration is particularly problematic, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the moment. Another group of prisoners that we're seeing increasingly in Australian prisons are prisoners from non-English speaking backgrounds. And there's a few reasons for this. One of the reasons is that the world is increasingly globalised, so we're just likely to have more people from interesting parts of the world in Australia, and so they're caught up with the general rates of incarceration. We also have a lot of prisoners who are former migrants, and there are certain crimes associated with certain groups coming into the country. So that's another reason why we have a lot of non-English speaking background prisoners. One group that people often don't think about when we talk about this group are actually Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners. For some people, English is their second, third, fourth or even fifth language, and so we have a lot of Indigenous prisoners who don't speak English that confidently. How's everyone going? Is everyone hanging in there? Yeah? Cool. Alright. So I mentioned Aboriginal prisoners. They make up about, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians make up about 2% of Australia's population, 2 or 3%. But they make up 28% of Australia's prison population. And I think that's a terrible indictment on our country that that's the case. There are lots of reasons for that. One of the things that we know for sure is that for the same sorts of crimes, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are likely to be incarcerated for longer periods, so that they actually receive longer sentences than non-Indigenous prisoners. Yeah, that's right, Oriel. There are similar imbalances in New Zealand, and it's the same in Canada, and I know that they've just hit an all-time record high for the number of Indigenous Canadians that are incarcerated too. So it's a big problem right across the world. It's exacerbated by the remoteness of some Indigenous communities as well. For example, when a prisoner is released, you know, they have parole conditions to meet. They might have to check in, the former prisoner might have to check in, you know, 100 kilometres away. That person may not be licensed, but they don't want to miss their appointment, so they'll drive to that appointment and then get busted for not having a licence. So all those sorts of things. The fastest growing group of prisoners in Australia is actually Indigenous women, and there's some evidence to suggest that women are deliberately offending to get away from domestic violence. So it's a really sad story. Talking about sad stories, technology in prison is really terrible as well. Fortunately though, in a couple of states they're beginning to look at technology more seriously and see the benefits in making technology more accessible, just for the running of prisons, but also for providing education as well. So for example, in New South Wales, they're actually moving to a system where there's still no internet, but actually all prison computers are networked so that materials will be able to be loaded centrally, and a number of prisoners in different locations will be able to access those. Victoria is also looking at a similar system. There is limited access in the ACT at the Alexander McConaughey Centre there, which is their only prison. And what they do there is that they actually whitelist particular web pages so that, for example, the USQ web page is whitelisted. Students can get as far as seeing the course specifications for the courses that they're doing or that they're thinking of doing, but they're actually allowed no further. So even though that they're able to theoretically access the internet, that internet is actually not enough for them to actually do any work or any study. Anyway, so I've been talking a lot about, just how it is for prisoners in Australia. Let's get on to actually what we're doing. So I'm going to talk today about the Making the Connection project, but this is only the latest in a whole series of projects that we've been doing from USQ. So we started with the unfunded Pleiades project. Now Pleiades stood for Portable Learning Environments for Incarcerated Adult Distance Education Students. That's my party trick, remembering what all of that actually means, what that stands for. And it was kind of where it all started. So we developed a version of the USQ Study Desk, which is our learning management system, which is based on Moodle. And because prisoners typically don't have much time in computer labs, we also gave them access to ebook readers. We changed all of our course materials into EPUB format so that the materials would flow on the screen. And we distributed those to prisoners at the Southern Queensland Correctional Centre, which is a Serco-operated centre, which is close to Toowoomba. From there, that was a really great proof of concept. We found that we could actually do that, and it was well received by the prisoners, but it was really labour intensive and costly to do. And we had to send a couple of ICT guys down to the prison to spend the whole day installing that and making it work, which with 14 prisons in Queensland is clearly not viable. We went from there to the Office for Learning and Teaching funded project called From Access to Success, and the idea of that was to get some automation into that learning management system. We couldn't afford to continue the e-reader trials under that project, so we also had another project that I didn't run but was involved with called the EEE project. And EEE potentially stands for e-readers, e-learning and empowerment, or some combination of those words anyway, 3 E's. And we deployed those e-readers into 5 correctional centres. We were also really aware that it wasn't just about putting technology into correctional centres, it was also about making sure that USQ processes were streamlined. When we took a look, there were some 104 touch points for education officers and prisoners to actually interact with at USQ, and so that made it very confusing and very inefficient. So through 2 projects, Paper to Pixels and Bridging the Digital Divide, we set about actually fixing up some of those processes so that it was more obvious where education officers and prisoners had to go to get information. So at the beginning of 2013, or at the end of 2013, we were awarded HEP funding, and at the beginning of 2014, we actually got the Making the Connection project underway. So let me talk a little bit about that. So the Making the Connection project was to build on that work we'd done before. With those other projects, we hadn't gone to many correctional centres. We'd only been to correctional centres in Queensland. We had managed to automate the learning management system to a certain extent, but it could still do with more automation and also making it more sustainable. We wanted also to be thinking about how these projects would live beyond the life of the project and get into USQ mainstream. Also, the focus of the Making the Connection project was very definitely on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners, like I said, vastly overrepresented in the criminal justice system and not just in incarceration. So we won $4.4 million over 3 years to see what we could do about this. How are you all going? Hanging in there? So cool. That's good to see. We've got yours still. Excellent. So originally we said, I've got 16 written down there, but originally we said we would go to 13 correctional centres. So that's obviously a much bigger number than we were originally in. So originally we were only in 1 correctional centre for the learning management system and 5 correctional centres for the e-book readers. So now we had to put our money where our mouths were and actually get it into more correctional centres. So originally we were going to work in Queensland, where we already had a really good relationship. Things were already working quite well. We were going to work with Victoria because we were having talks with Bendigo TAFE at that stage about potentially sharing the platform, and also in Western Australia because I had exhibited a lot of interest in what was happening in Queensland. So we were originally going to go to those jurisdictions. We actually managed to do better than that. So we've still got a year to go in the project. We're now in 20 correctional centres, and we're in Queensland. We're in 12 or 13 correctional centres in Queensland. We've just deployed our learning management system at Long Bay Jail, or the Long Bay Jail prison complex. We've just deployed at Risdon Prison in Tasmania, and I do apologise to any Tasmanians for misspelling Tasmania there. We're also in Western Australia. We're in 3 flights there, and we're also, just recently, we've gone to the Australian Capital Territory as well. So that was one jurisdiction we never thought we'd ever be at because they have limited internet access. But as I said, it wasn't enough for their students actually to be doing our courses. We're also in negotiations with South Australia. We're still holding on with Victoria and also the Northern Territory. So against all our expectations, probably by the end of the project, we will be in every Australian jurisdiction, which is pretty exciting. We've also decided that we will probably go to 2 remote Indigenous communities as well. We've been approached by the high school at Dumaji to come into that environment, and also probably to 1 other as well. So, you know, from little things, big things grow, and that seems to be the way that the project's going at the moment. We vastly underestimated the demand for what we were doing, and I can say that as of right now, through the project, we've got about 611 enrolments, so that's pretty exciting for us. So let me talk about the USQ Offline Study Desk. As I said, that's actually a version of Moodle. Thanks, Deb. It's actually a version of Moodle. The USQ Offline Study Desk that we run is usually 1 instance behind the Moodle that we run here at USQ, and that just gives us the chance to iron out any bugs and get rid of any little nasties that are lurking there. In the original project, in the original Pleiades project, what we did was to actually install our learning management system on the existing education server and via a virtual machine. Now the technical stuff I'm not great on, so you'll just have to bear with me. But we decided that was a bad idea because we didn't know what impact our courses were going to have on all the other stuff that was on that server. That server also housed all the vocational education and everything, and the cognitive programs and everything that the students participated in. So we didn't want to endanger those materials, and we also weren't sure what impact those courses were having on our materials too. And as a provider of higher education, we felt kind of obligated that we have to exercise some kind of quality control on what we're actually offering to our students. So now what we do is we use Linux Red Hat as an operating system on the server. We install a version of Moodle, like I said, which is one instance behind the instance we use for mainstream students. And we also install the courses that students are participating on onto that server, and that's hooked up via a network switch into the education lab. So prisons typically have education labs where they have 10 or 12 computers running off an education server. It got a little bit complicated. As I always say to people, it's really easy, well, it's not easy, but it's easy enough to write a funding application. It's really hard to actually make that work. And that's what we're finding with this. So about the same time as we started doing this, the university also introduced a learning objects repository, or an e-learning objects repository. So such that when a student is accessing materials through our learning management system, they're really accessing those materials through the e-learning repository and not via the Moodle. And the other thing, the really novel thing about the e-learning repository for USQ is that all that material is tagged and the copyright status is sorted out. And so copyright, I can't begin to tell you what a headache copyright has been for us. It's one thing students being able to access external materials through the internet. It's an entirely other thing for us to take them off the internet and make them available to students. So copyright has been very painful for us. Hopefully we've got it sorted out. We also had to, because we have that e-learning repository, we had to create some software that automatically harvested that material from the e-learning repository, and we also had to develop some software that would run through those courses to make sure that they didn't access the internet. More on that later. Yes, Kathy, you feel my pain? And so personal devices, this is where we're at the moment, and this is what we're dealing with. Because incarcerated students don't have that much access to computer labs, normally they only get a couple of hours a week because there's a lot of competition for those computer labs. There's vocational education, there's cognitive programs, there's all sorts of things that those computer labs are used for. If prisoners are preparing legal cases, for example, they need to get in and use the computers, and so on. And so we decided that a really excellent way to supplement their time on the computer labs would be to provide them also with a personal device that could go to, that they could take back to their cells and use in their own personal time. Now obviously that's really problematic because, you know, prisoners can be naughty, and that's often why they're there, and they're very good at hacking into computers, particularly if they're not supervised with them. So we've had to go to a lot of trouble to make sure that these computers are secure. So we're using 11-inch Dell laptops or Dell notebooks, and we wanted to do that because we wanted to use mainstream products. Because don't forget, in the back of our mind the whole time is how we can keep this project running or this initiative running beyond the life of the project. So we're trying to always, as far as possible, use mainstream processes and mainstream ideas. So USQ, in common with a lot of universities, uses Dell computers. So we had a pre-existing relationship with Dell, and so we decided to go for Dell notebooks. We're having to, through the BIOS, and again, I barely know what that is, but we've had to disable the cameras, the Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, the recording, all sorts of things that may cause a problem for students. So we've done that through the BIOS. We've also developed some software that enables education officers to be really easily able to check the computers. So they can log on separately to the students. Logan, I'll get to your question in a moment. So they can look at the software, they can see whether things have been enabled or disabled, they can see whether students have been accessing files they shouldn't have, and so on and so forth. And so this software is really good and helps us just to make sure that that security is maintained on those computers, but also lets us see really quickly if it hasn't. Now, Logan, thinking about tablets, and that's originally what we were going to use. We thought tablets would be ideal. But after the e-book readers, we did talk to the students about how they felt about them, and they actually thought that the screens were too small, that they couldn't get a big enough picture of what was happening, and they were also worried that using tablets, if they had an on-screen keyboard, that they wouldn't be able to type assignments and do that kind of stuff very easily. And you know what? I love my iPad more than just about anything else on this planet, but I wouldn't like to have to type up an assignment on it. So for various reasons, we decided not to go with the tablets. Another thing that we wanted was to make sure that students had access to something like Microsoft Office, because they were going to be able to use that once they got out of prison. It would be better if they could learn how to use that while they were in prison. And again, I know that's available on tablets, but we can make it readily available on those notebook computers. The educational history of most students, it's really, really bad for the most part. I mean, you know, kind of boys do better at school once they're a bit older and a bit better at learning. And so mostly they've had really, and most prisoners are men, that's what I should say, only 8% of prisoners are women. So we're talking about a whole cohort who have had bad educational experiences, often not having finished year 10, let alone having finished year 12 or gone beyond that. Numeracy and literacy rates are really low, and so most of them aren't ready to go into higher education at all. So generally speaking, only 1.5% of eligible prisoners do go into higher education, just because that need for numeracy and literacy and those lower levels of education are so much more necessary for those students. So good question, Chris. I should have mentioned that earlier. So you don't have to memorize this, but this is just to show you that it's a really not a very easy, it's not a very easy thing to do, is to get all of this technology happening. Because most courses and programs are designed to go out to the internet, right? That's just how you expect them to work. Anyone who's done any study lately or anyone who's taught lately will know that. You know, as students are zooming off to look at YouTube videos or they're going to the library to do research. And so we had to take online courses and actually switch them to offline courses, which meant that we had to get rid of all those links, find alternative resources that are copyright compliant and get them into the courses. And actually it was a really complicated process. So let me just move to the next slide. So the courses and programs that we decided to modify for use on these technologies, we've taught into prisons for about 25 years, so we had a really good idea of what prisoners traditionally enrolled in. We also talked to jurisdictions about what they would be comfortable with. Many jurisdictions were very uncomfortable with the idea of prisoners accruing a HECS debt that they would not likely to be able to pay off very easily. And for that reason, they wanted the programs to be pretty well vocationally oriented. When we first conceived of this project, we thought we'd offer a Bachelor of General Studies because that would give prisoners, you know, the opportunity to look at things from across the university and then be able to use those courses as credit against other degree programs. But the thing about that is that the jurisdictions couldn't see that. They could see that they were going to get a Bachelor of General Studies, which they thought was probably pretty useless for getting a job. So we had to rethink what programs we were looking at. We also talked to career practitioners about what prisoners could reasonably be expected to get employment in with a criminal record. So taking all those things into account, we ended up looking at the tertiary preparation program from 5 or 6 courses from that and the Indigenous Higher Education Pathways program. Both of those programs are enabling programs and they're Commonwealth funded. So students can participate in those without actually accruing any debt whatsoever. And also the really good thing about that as well is I've completely forgotten what I was going to say. Anyway, no doubt it will come to me later. Then we have 3 diplomas that we're offering. So we're offering a Diploma of Arts in Community Welfare and Development. We're offering a Diploma of Science in Environment and Sustainability. And we're looking at a Diploma of Business Administration because for many prisoners, the reality is they won't be able to find employment, and this is particularly true of sex offenders. Sex offenders or ex-sex offenders find it really difficult to get work, so they often look to become self-employed. So that's the suite of programs that we're looking at. Discriminatory. So maybe I should just clarify. So these are the programs and courses that we're offering through this project, but prisoners can still go into just about any program that they want to. It's just that those programs are outside of, programs are outside of the project. So Jan, is that what you are asking? Cool, okay. We're also looking at, because I said before, numeracy and literacy is a big issue. So we're looking at also English for academic purposes, which is also a Commonwealth funded enabling program, and we're also looking at other short courses for people who don't want to enrol in anything formally, and maybe looking at the open badged open learn courses offered through the Open University in the UK. So I've been in talks with them. All of those courses are open educational resources. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them about just about any topic imaginable. And we won't be able to use all of them, but maybe a handful of them to you know, just to whet the appetites of some of those potential students. Because as I said, they've had rotten experiences with education before. So challenges, there have been many. One of the challenges that I've had, even here at my own university, is that there's a lot of prejudice against prisoners. And I guess that's kind of understandable. If I had $1 for every time someone said to me, Helen, they're in there for a reason, you know, and that's absolutely true. But the reality is that 99.9% of prisoners actually get out of prison. Most sentences are really short. 90% of sentences are less than 1 year. You know, so we're going to have these people back out in into our community. We can also see that if we can get them a post-secondary qualification, they're probably significantly less likely to reoffend, they're less likely to access health services, they're less likely to access welfare services. So even on a financial you know, position, it's a really good thing to do. And totally true, Logan. Education has failed them up until this point. And it's so, I just can't tell you how amazing it is to see these prisoners just, you know, they enroll, they're really unsure about it, and when they start getting a few assignments back and they start getting some positive feedback, they're like 10 feet tall. And hearing the reasons why they want to do it, it just breaks my heart. You know, I was talking to one guy, and all he wants to be able to do is to help his 9-year-old daughter with her homework. His 9-year-old daughter's homework is too hard for him at this point. He wants to be able to help her. Several want to become role models for their community. Some are just sick of being in prison, you know, and they just don't want to come back again. They're looking for alternatives. They want to reimagine alternative futures for themselves and for their families. Yes, 9-year-old math, too hard for me too, Deb. I completely understand. And so the challenges are many. One of the big challenges that we have too is that there's prejudice against prisoners even within correctional centres. And a lot of custodial officers who look after the security side of things are very against prisoners having education. And education officers themselves, because of their role in that process, are often badly discriminated against. So it's really interesting. I could go on about this for days, but I better not. I'll make Alan nervous. Critical success factors. What we've done is we've tried to talk to everyone who's involved in this. So we started by talking to the jurisdictions, and we started by talking to the management. So for Queensland, for example, we've been talking to the Commissioner, and we've been talking to his staff to get them on board with what we're doing. And then we go and make our relationships with the individual correctional centres, and they give us help and advice as to where would be a good place for us to go, what it would be good for us to do, and give us those necessary introductions and contacts. We've talked a lot to the community sector and to the people who support these prisoners before, during and after they get out, about how we can fit in with their processes and what we can do. We've talked to probation and parole to see if we can encourage them to encourage prisoners who get out to continue their studies, to continue their education. And that's something that wasn't happening before. That was kind of something that was off their radar. So completely true what you're saying there about multi-generational trauma. It is massive. And I should also say too that these people have no social capital. They are very often the first in family to go to university. And so they're often belittled for that. Those people around them who in our world would be supporting us, in their world are saying, "Oh, you're too big for your boots now. You're forgetting your roots. You're forgetting where you came from." We do talk to prison health services. We talk to them as well, and I have been talking to them because what we think would be a really great thing to do would be to have some health programs on those computers and through our learning management system and on our servers as well. For example, Western Australia has a program looking at emotional intelligence and also looking at mindfulness. And I think, hey, what a great thing for them to be able to do, prisoners to be able to do, is to be able to take these technologies back to their cells and able to work through those programs in the privacy of their own cells. And also, you know, for a lot of prisoners, they just don't want to be in that classroom context. They're not comfortable in that classroom context, either because they've had bad experiences or they're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners who don't feel comfortable being in a classroom situation with non-Indigenous prisoners or being taught by non-Indigenous instructors. So there's lots of reasons why some prisoners just want to work by themselves. And generally speaking, in Queensland, we keep our prisoners shut up from 5 p.m. in the evening until 7 o'clock in the morning. So that's a lot of time where they're by themselves that they could use productively if they had access to this technology. Now, I reckon I'd better be quiet, otherwise we'll have no time for any questions. If you want to keep in touch with us, we have a project newsletter which you're very welcome to subscribe to. Or the other thing you could do is pop your email address into the chat. I can copy it down and make sure you're subscribed to that. This is my fantastic team. Of course, doing something like this, you don't do it alone, you do it with the help of a lot of people. So we've got about 13 people in our team, but we work with, we've figured out about 200 people across the university and hundreds more outside of the university. Okay, Lindy, great that you could make it along. Thank you for your support. And I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Helen, for the insightful sharing. I think there are a couple of questions. I can see that some of our members, oh yes, they are typing yes.
Good, now they're coming in. Okay, thanks Lisa. We are pretty excited about the project, and we're really excited that it's actually a lot more popular than we anticipated it would be. The demand for it has been huge. For example, we never expected to go to the Northern Territory, and now it looks like we'll be there before the end of the year, so thank you. Are there plans to take the program internationally, Deb? Yes, there are. We just wanted to get it working and happening here in Australia first. There are lots of other issues taking it internationally. Probably there wouldn't be the opportunity for us to necessarily use our programs and courses. So we also have to make it adaptable for other organisations and other educational institutions to be able to use our technologies and make sure that it works with them. Because as important as the technology is, all the stuff we do behind the scenes is really, really important as well. But yes, that is our plan. Thanks, Logan. Yes, one can get involved. One just needs to email me. So, Jen, if you did want to get involved, please just give me an email or a phone call, and I'm happy to talk to you about that. Okay, how do you implement activities that require engagement, participation, working on forums? You know what? That's a really hard one. We've had to take most of those activities out of our courses because, for a few reasons. First of all, we normally don't have enough people doing a particular undergraduate course in a particular correctional centre to actually enable them to work together in a group. So they don't get that opportunity for group work. We've actually stripped the forums out of the Moodle that we're using at the moment, and the reason we've done that is because there are provisos around students communicating with each other in prison. For example, there are typically two types of prisoner. There are those prisoners who are insecure, so they've either just come into prison or they're not as good as they could be, and so they're in that secure situation. And that's kind of like prison that you see on TV with the 2 levels of cells around the central courtyard and steps and so on, and they're secure. And you also have residential. And so these are kind of little self-contained huts or little self-contained buildings, and there might be 4 or 5 cells opening into a central area, but those prisoners actually cook and clean and look after themselves to a greater extent. In a lot of correctional centres, those 2 groups of people never ever meet. In some they do, but in most they don't. And so we had to disable forums to make sure that they didn't have a means of communicating between each other. Of course, they probably do by other naughty ways, but we can't be seen to be facilitating that. So a lot of what we're doing in that course redesign is looking at alternative forms of assessment, which is can be really tricky, because that's the very antithesis of what we know good teaching and learning to be. We want our teaching and learning to be student-centred. We want students going out looking for materials and resources. We want them working in groups. We want them to be creators of content, and none of those things are really very compatible with what happens in correctional centres. But I haven't given up, and I have a secret plan to continue research in that area so we can better at least simulate that kind of activity, because it's really important for the outside world. Okay, providing feedback on assessment, I'm thinking you mean here, Chris. We normally, what happens is the education officer collects the assessments from the student and submits that via the internet on their behalf, because education officers have access to the internet. That feedback is then provided to the education officer through the feedback. So basically, the education officer sort of mediates that feedback for us. We have all prisoners fill out a form before they study with us to nominate someone who can act for them on their behalf. Otherwise, legally as a university, we're not allowed to just give out information and talk about students without their permission. So we need to get the students' permission before we can actually start talking to the education officer about that particular student. That permission isn't always given, and it makes it very, very tricky. It would be great for non-prisoners who don't have the internet, and with just actually some data was just released from the last census saying that a lot of families who had internet can no longer afford it. And so instead of the number of people who have access to the internet is increasing, there are people in Australia who can no longer afford internet. So there are still a lot of Australians not accessing the internet. And also the NBN, as we all know, not going quite to plan. And so there are still large parts of Australia where it's just not feasible to be downloading heaps of multimedia via the internet. So we're very keen in actually doing something for that population. It's on our radar to do so. How do you prepare facilitators to, oh man, that has caused us great problems, that particular issue. It's really hard because we're asking we call them course examiners, but I think everywhere else in the world they're called course coordinators. It's a really tricky thing to rock up to a course coordinator and say, you know what, you're going to have to modify your course for incarcerated students, and this is going to be an imposition on your time. We do have funds to buy out a course examiner's time, and we do buy it out. Because of the way our workload model works, we are limited in how we can buy that out. So we can buy out marking, we can buy out delivery, we can buy out all sorts of things. But for some course examiners, all that is already bought out, and basically we're just asking them to do that on top of their coursework that they already do. So it's a big ask, and a lot of them are not happy about it. Having said that, they've all tried really hard, and they've come on board. We do brief them. We tell them as early as possible if their course is in scope for modification. We haven't had anyone say no yet. There have been some courses that are too difficult to modify, so we've had to find alternatives. We give them a very detailed overview of the process. We let them know. We make resources available for them, so we have a sprint team. Theoretically, a course modification takes place over an 8-week period, and we modify 6 courses at a time. And there are e-learning designers, learning designers, copyright people, multimedia people, graphic artists, all sort of people. There are about 15 people whose sole purpose in life is just to support these course examiners through this process. It's been so successful that we find a lot of what's been developed for the offline study desk is actually now being used on the online study desk. The resources that have been made have been such high quality that they're being used in the mainstream courses, which is really awesome. There are special considerations because they are prisoners. I mean, they can't have, I had someone ring me up and say, oh, I've got a video of a violent rape scene. Am I going to be able to keep that in? And obviously the answer to that is no. No pictures of scantily clad males or females, no pictures of firearms, just some of those sort of things. And it's just a matter of educating the course examiners about what it's really like in a prison, because, you know, people don't know, and of course they don't know. Why would they, unless they've been imprisoned? A lot of people actually try and deal with it rationally, which sounds a really good approach, but in my experience a lot of people in corrections aren't that rational, particularly when it comes to security. So something which sounds rational and reasonable is, you know, can be difficult. So we've got an example at the moment outside of the project where we have someone, a student who's doing a PhD in prison and needing to do their confirmation. Now, I can't imagine how they're doing their PhD in prison because it's hard enough outside of prison, but trying to organise a confirmation so that the confirmation panel can see the prisoner and the prisoner can present, you know, and we're saying, well, you know, our software, our video conferencing software is secure, but of course, you know, that doesn't cut it in the custodial setting. So there are lots of issues like that that are difficult to navigate. But, you know, who wants to be bored? It's all good. Is there anything else? I think we've got a couple of minutes.
Just have another 5 minutes more.
Ah, here we go, Oriel. Sorry, I didn't scroll down far enough. No, they very definitely, Oriel, just in answer to your question, they very definitely have to work solo. But what I didn't anticipate happening is around in these correctional centres where the project is working, learning communities are springing up. So they might not be doing the same courses or programs, but they actually gather together to work together and to talk about study, which just blows my mind because that's not something that we anticipated or planned for. And so we have people doing undergraduate programs, helping some of the people who are doing some of those bridging courses and so on like that. So they're working solo in their courses, but they're working together in the learning community. And the prisoners are telling me things like, well, we've stopped hanging out with the people we used to hang out with, who were probably not good influences anyway, and now we only hang out with students because they understand what we're going through. So even just in that community, they're learning more pro-social behaviours, which is really great. Ah, here we go. Now, Chris, that's what you're talking about here. It is really hard for those students who've had bad experiences to study. It is hard, and we try and put some intrinsic motivation into those courses. So we have a lot more emphasis on self-marking quizzes and stuff like that, just for formative assessment, not for summative assessment, just so that they get that feedback early on that they're doing well or they're on track. And we also have videos of the course examiners introducing them to the course and telling them about the course as well. I mean, we didn't anticipate this again when we wrote the project, but we have realised that these students need more support than most other students, and we're looking at ways how we can support them in a sustainable way. And one of the things that we're trying to do is actually talk to the University of the Third Age about providing volunteer tutors into the correctional centres. So we're hoping that might be one of the ways that we can support those students. So I'm just reading Claire's chat here. Them being transferred to another prison, Claire, is totally a bad issue that we've experienced as well. So we're in Queensland, we're at so many prisons now that the chances are they will go to another prison that is in the project. But that's not the case. That's not the case in most states. And we're looking at the feasibility of sending those notebook computers with the prisoner when they move to another prison so that they can continue their study. That's not one we've cracked. As you pointed out, it's a big problem. It's hard to follow up with students once they're released. Alan, I know we're running out of time here. Because they don't want to be followed up for the most part. They want to forget they were ever in prison. So it's difficult to track them down to see how they're going. And also, what I've tried to do is if they're about to be released, I encourage them not to go straight back into study, because things like finding a job, finding somewhere to live, reconnecting with family take precedence when they first get out. The other problem is, again, with sex offenders, a lot of them aren't able to access the internet once they're released. So that's an issue that we're also having to contend with. Yeah, I better not say anymore. Like I said, I could talk for days.
Okay, maybe we just pause here, end the session first, and if you have any other questions, please feel free to stay on. But I just want to thank Helen Farley for the great presentation and insightful, information that you have provided us, which I don't think we're able to find anywhere else, here. So thank you very much on behalf of ASCILITE. And ladies and gentlemen, we hope that you found this session really useful, and we will keep you informed about the webinar schedule in the coming weeks. Hope to see you again in the next webinar, and bye for now. Yeah, and we can pause the recording as well.
Okay.